Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. Hope everybody's doing awesome out there. I'm excited to be with you guys for another episode of Grade School. We're going to talk about our pre-recorded video that came out earlier this week and answer any questions you guys might have had on that, and dive a little bit deeper into this aspect of the workflow that we outlined in that video about color balancing and dealing with color and red, green, and blue, and sort of like how to deal with that portion of the process after we have initially set the table for ourselves in a color managed, and in this case specifically, a DaVinci wide gamut workflow. So I'm excited to talk about that subject with you guys today, answer any questions that may have come up for you as you were watching the video and working on implementing these concepts. We're gonna have a great session. So hope everybody's having an awesome week. I'm having a good week. My buddy Gadali is here. He's gonna help me get everyone's questions answered, and we're gonna have a great session. So let's get right into it. I wanna make a couple of announcements before we do. So first of all, I would love to hear from you guys for just my general knowledge. Who are your favorite colorists out there working? Do you guys have heroes that you follow, whose work you admire, who you are especially keen on, and why? What do you like about their work? Who would you like to learn from? Who are the colorists out there who you're like, man, I would love to know how she does that, or how he does this, or what the secret is there. I would just love to hear that from you guys, and for my own knowledge, because I know I have my heroes out there who I look to, and I'm really curious who you guys look to for inspiration and who you would be most interested to learn and hear from. Okay. What else? My Showlet course, which we've talked about a little bit in comments over the last couple of weeks, and I think in grade school as well. My Showlet course is coming up very quickly in March, and there is a link in the description for grade school today. For any of you guys who've been asking about creating Showlets or creating camera LUTs, or how to apply some of the concepts that we've talked about here in grade school pursuant to look dev or color management, how to actually take those concepts and cook them down into a LUT that you can use on set or hand off to your clients, your collaborators, for them to use on set. We are going to cover all of that stuff in depth in the Showlet design course. It's a 2-week course. And along the way, we are going to once and for all dispel the myths and half-truths and sort of fuzziness that tends to attend our understanding of LUTs as colorists and post-professionals. There's not a lot of good information out there, and the information that is out there is at best kind of like half-truths. So one of the big goals of this course, in addition to equipping you with your very own Showlet by the end of it that you can actually use, is to really empower you with knowledge that is fully correct and completely free of error, and that you know is fully correct and free of error, so that you can operate more effectively as a professional, but also so that you can educate your peers and your clients, and so that we can once and for all do away with all of this mythology and like shunning of LUTs that is out there, as well as all of this like worship of LUTs, and we can simply place them in their proper place as a very valuable tool for production and post-production professionals alike. So check out the link to that. I would love to see you guys in that course. It's a really fun 2 weeks. We're going to be doing a couple of live sessions a week. There's pre-recorded modules that you can work through at your own pace. And we also have a live Discord going for the duration of the course, where you're going to have access to me and you can ask me questions. I'm going to review your work as we go along. You're going to show me the LUTs that you're developing, and I will give you feedback on those. So it's a really valuable couple of weeks, and it's a great group of folks that usually turn up. So highly encourage you to go check that out. What else? As we continue talking about our DaVinci Wide Gamut workflow, I just want to mention again that my Elements LUT pack for DaVinci Wide Gamut is available on my website. Studio grade looks, really, really great looking stuff. It's, to be honest with you, a lot of the same rigor and ideas that go into my colloid plugin set, which I sell for a much more expensive price point. A lot of the best value and key attributes of those colloid looks are actually contained in these Elements looks at a much more affordable price point, and they are LUTs that are easy to deploy inside of a DaVinci Wide Gamut workflow. We saw in part 1 of the series that we are talking about today, DaVinci Wide Gamut workflow, that I'm using a DaVinci Wide Gamut, or rather my Elements LUTs here in the timeline for this project that we've been working on. So I've got my tone here and my palette there. They're super versatile, super fun looks, and they're a great way to get you on your feet with a nice looking look so that you can focus on the fundamentals of developing your color grading chops. And then when you're ready, you can say, hey, I want to try biting off look dev, and I want to see if I can do something that looks as good as, or maybe even better than the Elements LUTs. This is a great way to sort of ease your way into that process, because we made the analogy a couple of weeks ago here on grade school that we tend in modern color grading to kind of be thrown into the deep end of the swimming pool. And the analogy that I would make is colorists today, if we make the analogy of like learning to play a musical instrument, colorists are kind of given the equivalent of being told like, okay, you're going to learn to play the guitar, but you also need to simultaneously build your guitar. That's kind of the message that we get with like, oh, we need to do our own look dev as well as our own color grading. Historically, traditionally, in terms of cinema, the tradition of cinematic image mastering, those are separate disciplines. There's the people who develop print stocks and the sort of macro level transforms that drive an image reproduction. And then there's the color timers, the people who actually grade and modify the image on a shot-by-shot basis. And I actually think it's really beneficial to bite those things off in separate pieces. Not that you can't become very skilled at both, but you can't really become very skilled at both simultaneously. So go check out those Elements LUTs if you want to get a good foundation of looks that you can use and trust in a variety of settings, and focus on building up your color grading chops. What else? Let's see here. Within that, along that same line with those Elements LUTs, if you want to just get your feet wet with using my LUTs, you can also check out my Kodak 2383 film print emulation LUT. That's a free download. That link is in the description as well. And you can check that out and also use it on a variety of projects and get a film look within a color managed workflow, which is of course my whole jam. That's what we've been talking about in this series on DaVinci Wide Gamut Workflow, and what you guys hear me preaching week after week after week. Color management is not an option. Color management is not something cool that you should consider doing. Color management is the only way to be color grading in 2022. The days of having one camera that we shot on and one display that we are mastering for are gone, and they're not coming back. So we need to adapt, and we need to use good color science and good workflows that allow us to accommodate those variables in terms of cameras and displays in a way that doesn't completely hijack our creativity and steer us away from where we are really valuable as artists, which is applying our creative eye to the goals of our creative stakeholders and our clients. So if you want to start working with film print emulation inside of a color managed workflow, my Kodak 2383 is a great way to do that. It's a free download. You can start working with it as soon as you get the download pulled into your Resolve system. And what else? The last thing that I want to mention today is something that I've mentioned throughout this series, and that I'm going to continue to mention going forward here on the channel. The most important part of color grading to me is not about what you're doing with your hands and or about what you're seeing with your eyes. It's about the ideas that you have in your head, and about the passion and taste that you have in your heart. Okay, so we want to get our concepts straight. We want to get our ideas straight before we even start worrying about like, oh, well, what knob should I twist? How should I go about this grade? That starts with good concepts. And that's what my ebook, The Colorist's 10 Commandments, is all about, is getting those proper concepts in place that actually make it very easy to operate DaVinci Resolve or any other piece of software. Just to make a sort of simple example of it, if you throw me today into a brand new piece of grading software that I've never seen before, that no one's ever seen before, that there's no documentation on, I'm going to be able to find my way just fine. I'll have to stumble around and figure out like, okay, where's the gearbox? Where's the gas pedal? But I'm not going to have any trouble knowing how to use that software because my concepts are not going to change. That's just a matter of figuring out how I apply those concepts in whatever software or environment I'm working in. So that's really the ideal for us as artists, is we want to have concepts that precede the software that we're working in, or the workflow that we're using, or the technology that's in place. We want to have concepts that we can carry with us and apply to every single job and project that we tackle, regardless of the particulars of our software or the project itself. So definitely encourage you to check out the Colorist's 10 Commandments ebook as well. Those of you guys who've already picked it up, let me know in the comments as well, what is the number one thing that you have learned from reading that book. I know there's been a lot of really good questions that have come out of it, and I feel like there's been a lot of good feedback about what you guys have taken away from it, and I'm always really keen to hear what the most important, most transformative aspect of that read has been for you. So let me know about that down in the comments. And that's all I got, announcements-wise. So let's get into some questions. Let's get into some grading. Gadali, what do we got out there?
All right. Eduardo is got a question here. He asks, when in a wide color gamut like Airy, Log C, or DaVinci wide gamut, and you change the gamma in a specific node to linear, the offset wheel no longer makes a photometrical exposure adjustment, but the gain wheel does. Can you explain why this happens?
Yes, I can. Math. That's my wise answer for you. It's just the way that things work mathematically. I mean, we could get really geeky and evaluate this in like a graphing calculator. I'm going to skip that experiment for today. But it's just the way that the math shakes out. When you add things in a logarithmic tone curve, you are getting an overall increase in intensity. And when you multiply things in a linear tone curve, that's the way you get an intensity. So that's one of those questions that is so simple that it actually having a very pat answer sort of eludes you. But suffice it to say, that's just the way that the math works. And in fact, like you can still use both of those operators in either space. So like here on, I'm in log right now. And as Eduardo observes, offset does a thing here in log, does an exposure thing when I'm in a log domain. And if I move into a linear domain, offset's going to do something different. If I change my gamma to linear here, and if I play with my offset, I'm going to be lifting everything right here. So like this is actually an operator that is sometimes used. This is a pretty handy way of recreating or minimizing either capture or display flare, because you can see the actual bottom of my image is being picked up when I do this. So offset is, you can still use this operator in a linear domain, but it's no longer modeling exposure or the response of, or the additional stimulus of light, I should say. And similarly, back in our handy dandy or our good old fashioned log domain, I can apply gain in here, right? Gain still does a thing, but gain is applying a contrast adjustment here in my log domain. It's stretching out the top and making it go further from the bottom, or if I go negative with my gain, it's making me go closer. So it's one of those fundamental just properties of these different tone curves that's easier to commit to memory than to ponder the exact mathematical explanation for, that offset is going to model the response of like an increase or a decrease in light when you are in a log domain. And when you're in a linear domain, you're going to do that with gain. You can use gain in log, you can use offset in linear, but they are going to have different effects than creating a photometric exposure adjustment.
Okay, Raphael has a question. When using node-based color-managed DaVinci intermediate workflow, I noticed that placing noise reduction after my final output gives little to no visible results, while placing it before the first color space transform works as intended. Any idea why?
Good question. So let's just quickly demo this out, okay? So the question is essentially this. If I'm going to, just so for everyone who hasn't seen me do this before, all I'm going to do right now is take the color management settings that we used in the videos, the last two videos on DaVinci Wide Gamut workflows that we set up here. I'm going to turn these off, and I'm simply going to recreate the same color management in nodes, okay? Because this question is pursuant to operating in nodes. So we're going to create an input transform on this side, like so, where we're going to go from Arri Alexa, because that's what this camera is. We're going to go to DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, no tone mapping, nothing fancy. We'll call this in. And then here on my timeline level, I'm going to do a node downstream of my look, where we are going to go from DaVinci Wide Gamut out to Rec 709. Okay, so this is effectively going to give me exactly the pipeline that I had a moment ago. It's just that I'm now accomplishing it with nodes as opposed to at my project level. So the question is this: when we apply noise reduction, here's our, let's label this our out. When we apply noise reduction here in node number 3, we get different results than if we apply noise reduction here in node number 5. And we can probably pretty easily see that. I wish I had a noisier shot to audition this on. Take my word for it. This is a correct observation that Raphael is making, that noise reduction here has a much different effect than noise reduction here. Namely, noise reduction here, a little is going to go a lot further than here, right? This is actually something that we see in a lot of different tools when we are working in a color managed or a log environment. You guys might have noticed if you tried to follow along with this week's video on color balancing, that when we're in this log container, it does not take much to move around the balance of our image, does it? These little nudges, like in that video, you could see I was making little nudges and getting pretty significant effects, right? Like you can see the image is moving around a lot, and I'm not going more than a point or two down here in my offsets. It's much touchier than if I were to do the same kind of adjustments here in Rec 709, right? So that's a good general rule of thumb. When we are in a log container, little adjustments have more effect. And that actually stands to reason because, like, let's think about it this way. By the time we're out in our display space, by the time we've transformed into Rec 709, it's sort of like, this is an analogy I think I made at some point in another video. It's sort of like trying to play with the recipe for a cake before it goes into the oven versus after. We can still do stuff to change like the appearance and the taste of a cake after it comes out of the oven, but we're going to have to hit it a lot harder. We're going to have to do more, and it's going to be more difficult than if we change the ingredients before it ever goes into the oven, right? So that's why it's because of the state of the image and about what happens to the image after the fact. Everything is being sort of like cooked, baked together by my output transform. So whatever I do upstream of my output transform is going to go into the oven and be altered by that baking process. And that's why noise reduction here is going to have a more pronounced effect than it will if I do it here. And by the way, as I said, that's a good thing, whether we're talking about balance or noise reduction. Being able to do less and get more, that should be our goal always when we're color grading. So that can give us an intuition right there that, hey, this is a good endorsement of working in a log or a scene or a working space, because I actually can push things far less hard and get similar results to what I would get by pushing them a lot harder by the time I'm out in my display space. So it's a question of the state of image that we are applying that noise reduction in and the operations that are happening downstream of that noise reduction being applied.
Okay. And Rafa is here with a question. Wouldn't using gain and linear to get the color balance of picture in the same way better than, hold on, I have to rephrase this question in my head. Wouldn't be using gain and linear to get the color balance of the picture in the same way than offset would be better? In HDR, the temp and tint tools seem to reveal a similar curve than that adjustment. Does that make sense?
Hit me with that one more time.
Would it be better to use gain and linear to get the color balance of a picture? Would that be better than offset? In HDR, the temp and tint tools seem to reveal a similar curve to the gain adjustment, I guess.
Okay, I think I follow there. Yeah, so the portion that I follow anyway is like, hey, you know, we were doing all of our balancing in this balance node this week in this week's video. Would it not be better to switch this balance node into a linear tone curve? So those of you who don't already know what I'm talking about, by default right now in my color managed workflow, I am operating in DaVinci Intermediate as my tone curve, which is a log tone curve, similar to log C or ACES CCT or Cineon if we go all the way back to the sort of original specified log encoding for motion images. I'm operating in a log curve. And the question is, if I were to move the image into a linear curve, as we were talking about just a moment ago with Eduardo's question, would I not be able to get better results in terms of my balancing? The answer is maybe, for sure. It's a definite maybe. I do a lot of stuff, as those of you know who've been following me for a while, I do a lot of stuff in linear, and I almost tend to think of linear as the default state of things more so than log, because linear, as the name implies, is actually the response of the sensor to the stimulus, right? So if I double the amount of light hitting the sensor, then I'm going to end up recording double the intensity of signal when I'm operating in a linear tone curve. That's a very straightforward way of encoding information. It's not a terribly efficient way of encoding information, and it also doesn't particularly well model the response of the human eye. So those are a couple of the reasons why we tend to so often work in a log curve. But I like to work in linear curves for a number of things. I like to do them for exposure, for sure. And in terms of using them for balance, you absolutely can. And one of the things I actually like about doing this is the response gets a little bit more nuanced than when we're in log, which can be helpful if you're trying to make fine-tuned adjustments here. So that's sort of an aside, but one thing that I do like about applying things in linear. Ultimately, you're not going to see a huge difference between those things. It's a very slight, if I were to produce equivalent corrections, if I were to try to give you the same balancing adjustment in log versus in linear, log using offset, linear using gain, and you gave me a side-by-side and I was just trying to line up one to the other, the results would be pretty much indistinguishable depending on the actual frame. It's a very, very small difference in terms of the actual material difference between those two operators, but definitely something you shouldn't be afraid of and something I would encourage trying out and experimenting with.
All right, I've got 2 questions here about using parallel nodes. Do you use them for color? Some seems like one colorist here tends to use a bunch of steps in parallel rather than serial. Any thoughts around that?
I don't use parallel nodes, and I'm going to confess something to you guys. I like to think of myself as somewhat of a DaVinci Resolve expert. I know the software pretty well. I teach for Blackmagic design. I don't really understand parallel nodes, simply because I don't use them. I don't see the utility. And when I say I don't understand, I'm being a little hyperbolic. I understand the idea of them. I understand the conceit of them. But personally, no, I don't use them. I just have never had anyone explain to me what the advantage would be. It's not as if, one of the sort of benefits I had given to me when I was first shown them was like, oh, well, that way you can keep your image clean in different chains and do different things and not degrade your image, and have different states. But the truth is, when we're working in a color managed workflow, there's nothing I'm going to do. No matter how hard I push the image in any direction I might want to go, I can always bring it back in the next node. It's not like I am doing something that I only want that I can't undo later in the stack. So that was one sort of explanation that I had offered to me that I don't feel has held water. But no, in general, as you guys know, at the node level, at the shot level, at the individual level, I try to keep things as dirt simple as possible. So if anywhere, that would be something that I would deploy in a look dev environment, but it's just something that has never presented itself as valuable to me there. Now, I'm always open to learning new things, so I would love to hear from you guys if you're like, dude, you're snoozing on parallel nodes. They're going to change your workflow. Here's how I use them. I would love to hear that because I see people using them all the time, but I've never seen them used in a way that I'm like, oh, that's really cool. That nets me something that it could be useful that I can't get in some other way. So wish I had more of a juicy answer though, but no, it's something I've never once done a grade with a parallel node. A job, I should say.
All right. And Alexander is here wondering, does DaVinci Wide Gamut have a similar problem with neons as ACEs? If so, is there a fix for it?
Good question, and I'm happy to say no, it does not. And without going fully into the weeds there, the so-called neon problem with ACEs, that's a very simple problem that when I finally understood what the source of it was, I was kind of mad because there's a lot of awareness of that problem out there, but there's far less awareness of its origin and why it's there. Do you guys know why that neon problem exists in ACEs? And let me just since we're in a manual color managed environment anyway, I'll bet this will ping it right here if I had to guess. Maybe not, but let's just do a quick ACEs thing here. So I'm just going to disable everything and just temporarily say ACEs transform from Alexa to Rec 709, and let's try maybe ACEs 1.2. Okay, it's sneaking under the wire here. But the neon problem tends to accompany colors of this sort, quite bright, quite saturated colors, specifically in the sort of cyan teal region, are the most common culprits, where you get breakage or you get clipping and you get artifacting. The reason for that is very, very simple. The reason is because ACES CCT, which is the working color space for ACES, the primaries, meaning the outer boundary, the overall size of that color space, is actually smaller than a lot of cameras, for example, the Arri Alexa. So when I input map from Arri Alexa into ACES CCT, if I have colors that are in Arri's color space, but outside ACES CCT, I'm going to get that clipping issue because there, until ACES 1.3, was no sort of like gamut mapping or compression or fitting of that larger camera gamut down into the ACES CCT gamut. That was just being scaled in a normal way, so things were being allowed to go negative and clip and artifact and do all those things. And that's really a result of the fact that ACES was the first standard on the scene for color management, and we owe a huge debt to them for helping like move the conversation forward about like, hey, industry-wide, we got to do better, guys. We got to color manage. Camera manufacturers need to give us specs for how to transform the source footage, their material from their camera into a color managed environment. Huge credit to ACES, and it's an incredibly they're a great group of folks, and I'm really excited for ACES 2.0. But the reason that that problem exists is because ACES has been around for a while, and when that gamut was devised, it seemed sensibly large enough, and it only became outdated after the fact. So long answer that I could have simply given by saying no. That neon clipping issue that we see in ACES is not present in DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate and never will be, because DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate is designed to be obscenely large. So any camera gamut that we can really imagine reasonably being devised, either that already exists or will be created tomorrow, is going to fit inside of that gamut and not have things that reach beyond the boundaries of the DaVinci Wide Gamut.
All right. Bill has a question here about, is there an advantage to using traditional color wheel offset or the HDR tools global color wheel offset? Okay, so basically offset on the primaries or offset on the HDR palette?
Yes, great question. So this is a good one for you guys to know, and I hope for all of you guys that turn up for grade school that you don't only show up for your questions to get answered, but for other questions to get answered. This is a great question that's been asked, and I hope all of you guys can take the answer to questions like this and keep them in your back pocket, keep it in your kind of mental file so that you can build out your index of answers to questions about like, how does my workflow work? How do I like to do things? What is the way that I navigate my challenges? So this is a great fundamental question to ask, like, okay, all things being equal, when should I be thinking about using offset in my primaries versus when should I be thinking about using my global wheel in the HDR zones palette? What's the difference between them? Which is better? Should I always use one or the other? Should I change which I use dependent on the circumstance that I'm in? These are really good questions to ask and to have the answer to for your workflow. So I'm going to give you this answer. This goes back once again to my ebook, which I mentioned a couple minutes ago, The Colorist 10 Commandments. One of the chapters in that book, actually, which I talked about in this week's pre-recorded video, is that simplicity beats complexity. What do I mean when I say that? I mean, all things being equal, if I have two operations, both of which can net me my desired result on an image, the better operation is the simpler operation. And I give a variety of reasons in the book for why exactly that is and the advantages of always choosing the simplest possible solution that gets you the results that you need. So if we think about the primaries versus the HDR zones palette, we've talked about this before. We talked about it this week. Offset is the simplest operation we can perform in DaVinci Resolve. Nothing is ever going to trump offset in terms of that simplicity to complexity spectrum. So that's where we want to live. If we're like looking at those two, the only time I would ever consider using the global wheel is if I am unable to get a result using the offset. But the burden of proof, if we want to put it in my favorite legal jargon, the burden of proof is on the global wheel here to prove itself more useful than my offset. Otherwise, I'm going to use my offset because my offset is simpler. And if you want to get a more detailed explanation of why I am such a firm believer in simplicity and the benefits that I feel like it affords our workflow and our end results, go check out the ebook. I go into those in detail, and it really does make a huge difference to your workflow to always choose the simpler of the two options. And just to very briefly summarize, like, okay, well, what is the difference? Why is this more complex? If we compare these two operators, offset, if we just think about like math for a minute, offset is always going to do the exact same thing regardless of the color space that you're in, regardless of anything else. Offset is just addition and subtraction to your red, green, and blue channels, either simultaneously or individually. That's it. It's just arithmetic, just addition and subtraction. The global wheel inside of the HDR zones palette has a whole fancy bookended process where before it even does anything here, it's actually transforming me into a linear tone curve, which we talked about earlier, specifically a flavor of linear known as an LMS model, which is meant to model sort of the response of the human eye to different colored stimuli, okay? So that's very cool and a very sophisticated tool, and I'm glad that it's here because I definitely will use this sometimes. But you can hear already, just going that far, that's more complex than adding or subtracting. That's bookended color space transform from your working color space into linear LMS, operation being performed in linear LMS, and then you're round tripping back from linear LMS back into your working color space. That's just fundamentally more complex. If that serves your needs and it serves them in a way that a more simple operation cannot, go with God. That's a great operation. Otherwise, you should be looking for the simplest possible tool that gets the job done.
Okay, question here about timeline color space from Troy. Regarding timeline color space in the project settings, when using it in and out CSTs to transform into wide gamut, DaVinci wide gamut, does the timeline color space matter?
Yes, it does. And I'll spare us the full summary, but I gave a summary. Oh, I will do my very best to remember to leave a link to this in a YouTube community post after we finish here today. But we talked about this in detail, maybe like toward the end of last year, I think in December or early January. We talked about when I am, basically the question is this, when I'm color managing like I have right now, when I'm color managing in nodes, and I'm using DaVinci YRGB color science as opposed to one of these three options, it would seem on its face that, like, just watch what happens right now. If I go from if my timeline color space is DaVinci wide gamut intermediate right now, and let's change it to something completely different. Let's say Rec 709 gamma 24, okay? Watch my image here when I hit save. Okay, nothing happens. So it would seem that this doesn't matter at all, right? That's actually not the case. There are a number of important effects that this has that I would refer us back to that prior episode of Grade School on, because I think we spent about 30 minutes talking about it. But really, to really briefly summarize it, some of the things that it's going to have an effect on are your HDR zones palette, which we were just talking about, your color warper over here, which we were just talking about. It is going to affect the metadata that is embedded in your file when you deliver it. It is going to affect how these operations are performed when you transform into linear. So just an easy alternative example, if I'm in this linear tone curve and I'm applying what right now is like a photometric exposure type thing, if I change my timeline color space now, I'm going to see a huge change in this image. Like so. Because the underlying assumptions that are being used to transform into linear from working space and then back from linear into that working space, those assumptions change when I change that timeline color space. So for a full rundown on that, check out that prior episode of Grade School, which I'll track down the episode and time code for you, and you can watch the full summary there.
Okay, question about Blackmagic color spaces. Why does Blackmagic have so many options in the CST? Shooting on 6K B-RAW, but only option is 4K Gen 4 instead of 6K Gen 5. So basically, the question is, how do you deal with Blackmagic cameras and their very many options of color spaces in color space transform?
Yeah, good question. It's tricky. And in terms of like, why is it that way? I think it's that way because Blackmagic is new to the camera and the like designing color spaces and tone curves game. They've only been there for a couple of years, and it's only one of many avenues of the like products that they put out. And I think to their credit, they've been improving and refining and figuring it out. And when they do, they put out a new color space and a new tone curve, and they load it onto their cameras and they change the workflow around. So I do see a positive evolution with those things. I think that's why it's changing so much, because they're new and they're committed to getting the best possible image for the end user. In terms of how to navigate it, I don't think I've ever done two jobs using Blackmagic footage in the same way. It like, because I only do a couple a year, at least that's how it went last year. And every time I did, I kind of had to go back to the drawing board and be like, okay, what's the latest and greatest best practices? Like, how was this captured? What are my options in Resolve in terms of color managing this footage in the best way? Sometimes I will even check out the Blackmagic forums or reach out to Blackmagic Design, because I'm a DaVinci Resolve Studio customer, so I've got customer support, and I'll actually ask for input on like, hey, how should I be navigating this? What's the best recommendation as of today? It changes a little bit. I've never done two projects shot on Blackmagic cameras where the workflow was the same. It changes a lot. And if you compare that to like, an Alexa or something, my Alexa workflow has not changed for many years in terms of like how I input it and the overall pipeline that I'm going to use around it. That's more stable because Alexa has been around for a longer time and it's had a chance to mature. Blackmagic is still working on developing the best possible set of parameters and kind of overall workflow to get the best images for the user. So it's a moving target for sure. And to be honest with you, off the top of my head, I wouldn't want to give you specifics because it's been a minute since I did a Blackmagic job, and the parameters and the best practices have probably changed since the last time I did it. But those would be the resources I would look to. I would look to forums. I would look to, if you have a studio copy of DaVinci Resolve, reach out to Blackmagic support directly and just try to piece together what the best practices are. But don't get frustrated if you're like, why is this more confusing than it feels like it needs to be? It just is. And if you call me tomorrow and you say, hey, I want you to grade my Blackmagic project for me, I'm immediately going to ding in my head like, okay, I'm going to need to dedicate an extra hour or two to figuring out what the best practice and what the ideal workflow is going to be in February of 2022 for managing that, because it has probably changed since the last time I did a job with those cameras.
Workflow question from Aurora Films. On a DaVinci wide gamut project, how would you round trip plates for VFX work? Thinking of exporting linear EXR for VFX and being able to see the image with the same DaVinci wide gamut display transform in external apps.
Oh, that's a really good question. So I think anytime you were talking about VFX round trip, like 99% of it is about communication. Like the standards are kind of easy when everyone's on the same page and they really understand each other. I would, like when I'm working with VFX vendors, I try to let them take the lead because they often have workflows that they're comfortable with, and I don't want to rock the boat. Like I'm happy to meet them where they're at. So I'll let them take the lead and I'll say, hey, you call the ball. You tell me what you would like me to give you. Okay. And so like, let's just do a hypothetical. Let's say this VFX vendor I'm working with says, we do everything in ACES. You have to give us ACES. I'm going to say, no problem. I will translate everything. If I would flip everything into DaVinci YRGB like this, or if I was in DaVinci YRGB color managed, I would right click on my shots and bypass my color management, figure out a way to turn off my actual color grading stack, if that makes sense. And I would simply hand off to them. I would go DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate to, if they wanted it, I would go to ACES Linear. I would discourage if they were like, oh, we want ACES CG, which is not an uncommon VFX standard. I would discourage that simply because ACES CG is AP1 primaries, same primaries as ACES CCT, which mean they're going to have the same potential problems as we talked about with that so-called neon clipping issue that we discussed a moment ago, where I have DaVinci Wide Gamut, which is way larger than AP1, which means that I could potentially have out of gamut values that I'm encoding into that space. So I would encourage them like, hey, if you want ACES, let me give you full big boy ACES AP0 primaries, which are only ever so slightly smaller than DaVinci Wide Gamut, so less of an issue. But this is what I would do. I would change my color space transform to DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, turn all this stuff off. Just linearize it from DaVinci Y Gamut Intermediate to Aces Linear and hand that off to them. And then all I ask in return when I'm working with a vendor is like, hey, you tell me what you want. And all I ask in return is that you give me the same thing back, okay? So that would be kind of like part number one. And then we can also talk like I will work with vendors as needed. Sometimes they'll want an accompanying like viewing LUT that they can put at the tail of their stack so that they can get a contextual view of the work that they're doing and see it reproduced in a similar fashion to what I'm going to do. So that would be where show LUT design and figuring out how to export and create that asset for that VFX vendor would come into play, and I would apply the principles that we're going to be talking about in my show LUT design course to be able to furnish them with a viewing LUT that works for their working environment and allows them to get a proper context for the work that they're doing in terms of where the color is ultimately going to go. But just think about it that way. Like let the vendor take the wheel, let them take the lead and tell you what they need, and then just figure out how to feed that to them. And then all you have to ask in return is that they give it back to you in the same way so that when you get everything back, we'll go back to our normal workflow here. And if I get a VFX asset, which I'll kind of have to mock up, all I have to do if I am color managing, whether manually or in nodes, is change my input. And now my input is going to be Aces Linear back into DaVinci Y Gamut Intermediate. This doesn't look right because this image is not Aces Linear, but it's as simple as that. These color space transforms make it pretty easy to move in and out of other color spaces, whatever your vendor wants. So let them tell you what they want, make them happy. And then you simply would slot things into your pipeline using color space transforms, if that makes sense.
Question from Marcus about RAW. Should you use the RAW tab to balance images or just to adjust exposure?
You know, that's a really good question. I'll give you guys my take. Unless I'm doing a show that is all one camera, which is fairly rare. This film is actually an example of that. Happens less and less these days. And this one happens not to be airy raw material. It's ProRes, as you can see. If I'm doing a show that is all one camera and all shot raw, I suppose I would consider using the camera raw tab to balance and do exposure. But in general, I'll put it to you this way. I want to make my exposure and balance adjustments with the same tool set on every single image, regardless of how that image came to be into my sphere. So if I have airy raw on one side and I've got some Sony S-Log over here and I've got some Rec 709 archival over there and I've got, like camera X over there, like some Canon C300, like B-cam type thing. By the time I've got all that loaded into my grading environment and properly color managed, I want to be doing my shot level adjustments of those shots with identical tools in all cases, so that the only discrepancy is what the shot needs, as opposed to the tools that I'm using to adjust it. So for that reason, I tend not to touch the camera raw tab. I tend to debayer at the ISO. In the case of red, I will debayer at the ISO that the camera operator set, and I'll debayer at the color temperature that they set, so that I'm seeing like, those are important factors that I generally wouldn't want to move myself. And then I'm going to do everything else here in the node graph. You're not going to get better results necessarily over here. All you're going to do is apply operations and behaviors that you can't apply in images that are not in raw or in that same raw state, and end up having to go like, okay, so I'm balancing with temp and tint for my airy raw, and then I'm balancing with RGB for my S-Log. It just introduces, in my opinion, unwanted variability into the process. So get your metadata, like specifically your color temp and your ISO, get those to reflect what was set up in production, and then do everything else here in the node graph of Resolve would be my advice.
Another workflow question from Christian. Is there a point to balancing something like an episode in a network show before applying the look? Or should the show LUT and power grade be applied first to mirror what was shot on set and then balance more to feel rather than the balancing before your look is applied?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I see the logic there, but I'm going to give you my take. Another chapter from the Colorist 10 Commandments. Macro beats micro, right? So macro beats micro means that if I have an adjustment that, if I just imagine this continuum of like, all right, I have the starting line of my grading process where all of my shots are just in their camera negative original state. And I have the finish line where everything is perfectly finessed and tuned and transformed for display. I'm happy, the client's happy. All of our notes and all the details have been addressed. We're done. We're shipping this grade. If we imagine that continuum and think about this macro versus micro thing, what that essentially means is that if I have an operation or a transform that brings 5 shots closer to that finish line, that's more valuable than an operation that only brings 1 shot closer to that finish line, right? So if we think about that balancing thing, that's really only going to work. We're going to need to balance on a shot-by-shot basis at some point, as we talked about in this week's pre-recorded video. But those are going to be localized things. Those are only going to happen 1 shot at a time. So my take in terms of this macro versus micro thing is that we want to use our greatest value adds. We want to break those out earlier than later, right? So a transform such as a, like broadest example would be this transform, which takes me from my working space to my display space. That transform doesn't serve 1 or 5. That serves every single shot in my timeline. This moves every single shot in my timeline further from how it started and closer toward where it needs to go, toward that finish line, right? That's fundamentally more valuable and something that I want to front load. I want to do that first before I get into shot level adjustments. And the other thing that kind of accompanies this idea that I talked about a bit in this week's video is that your balancing decisions are actually going to change depending on the pipeline, including your creative look that you set up around the shots. So you want to be making those balancing adjustments with as full a context as possible, because it may make a little difference or it may make a big difference, but your color management pipeline and the look that you slot within there is going to change the response of a balancing operation. It's going to change what you see and what you feel needs to happen. So you want to have those things fully slotted into place and be balancing at that individual level in as efficient and full context of a form as possible, because that's fundamentally less gains to begin with, because you're only going to get those, the image is only going to look better 1 shot at a time. So you want to make that as easy a process as possible, and you want to, I think about it like, back in high school when you would skip over the tough questions on the test. The balancing of individual shots are the tough questions on the test. The easy questions on the test is like, well, what's your color management? Easy. DaVinci wide gamut to Rec 709 gamut 2.4. Well, what's your look? Easy. I know what I'm looking for. I know I dialed in my look on a couple of hero frames. I know what that looks like, and I know it's not going to change. Those are the easy questions on the test. Get those out of the way, and then do your balancing with the time that remains, and you'll be in the best position to get things as close to where you want them to go as quickly as possible, if that makes sense.
All right, question here about titles from Lindsay. To summarize, basically, she's working on a timeline with mixed camera formats. Then when applying titles, the color management seems to have gotten out of whack. So advice for working with titles on a color managed project.
Yeah, so to be candid, it's been a while since I did that, because I'm pretty much solely in the color realm. I don't tend to do onlines or things where there's actual graphic elements, but if I had them in there, let me turn off my node-based color management here. Probably all I would do at the outset is like let's say I'm going to have to kind of mock this up for you guys. Let's say this is a graphic asset. I'm just going to right click and say bypass color management, because generally graphics are going to come to you in Rec 709. And if you're outputting Rec 709, which is going to be the most common scenario, you can just kind of skip over the whole thing. It's not like you need to grade the graphics, right? It's not like you need to get a photometric adjustment on a graphic. You just need the graphic to be left alone, which it sounds like is the speed bump that is being hit here, of like, oh, something's getting moved around in a way that I don't want. So this would be the absolute simplest way of dealing with that. The other way of dealing with it that I talked about, I think in a recent episode as well, is let's say you have an SDR or a Rec 709 or an sRGB source graphic that you've been provided, but you're actually delivering HDR. In that case, you can't just bypass your color management, because that SDR Rec 709 graphic is not going to properly reproduce on an HDR display. So in that case, you actually will need it to be pulled into your color management stack. And in that case, I would just set my input color space to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 or sRGB. There's no single like precise right answer to that question, but you would pick either like some flavor of Rec 709 or sRGB in order to input map that graphic into your working space. And then the rest of your color management pipeline would take care of translating that out to your, in this case, HDR display space. So that would be solely if you are actually delivering HDR or planning to do so in the future. If you're not, if you're just doing a 709 thing, the simplest solution in my book is to work with color management at your project settings, like I have here, and then to right click on any such shots where you don't have, or such shots that are just graphics, and just bypass your color management. You're not going to need to do anything to them. And if you do, it can easily be handled by just making a quick gain adjustment up or down if they need to get a little, like darker or brighter in order to slot in with the rest of your material. Hope that helps.
All right. Do you use a fixed node tree or a custom-made one, depending on the project?
Yeah, good. Sorry, was there a second part there?
Nope.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I do. I mean, I kind of gave you guys like the prototype for it in this DaVinci Wide Gamut workflow series we've been working on. But my template node tree tends to be very, very spare, and it tends to kind of follow the recipe that I've started laying out in this series. There's going to be something for exposure. That's always going to be first. There's going to be something for ratio. That's always going to be the next thing up. Something for like adjusting not just the overall exposure, but like the tonality, the contrast of the thing. And then there's going to be something for my overall RGB balance. And that's generally going to be it in terms of a template node tree. I'm not a big believer. You'll hear other colorists talk about like, well, I know, or I think I may, it's likely that at some point I'm going to need to create 1 power window or 10 power windows. So I'm going to go ahead and build out a template node tree with 10 power windows. I see the logic of that, but I think it's sort of backwards. I think like if you have a template node graph with 10 power windows in it, to make that example, there's that old saying that work expands to fill the time allotted. Like if you have it there, you're going to end up using it. And my whole approach, as you guys know, is I want to keep things as dirt simple as possible. I'm constantly chipping away at my node graph and asking like, okay, it's fine if everything is working, even if I don't have any notes at the moment, but am I doing this as cleanly as possible? Is there any fat in my node tree? And if so, how can I trim it away? So for that reason, my template node graph tends to be dirt simple. And like from here, as we're going to talk about in part 3, which is coming out this week of this series, I'm going to do my secondaries as needed. So that's going to be things like power windows or custom curves or like a hue versus hue curve or whatever I'm doing. I'll just do those as subsequent notes, but they're not part of my template node tree because I'm not planning on making secondaries. My goal, my expectation of myself when I'm grading is I'm going to set up color management that works really well, that's accurate. I'm going to get a really great look in place that I feel like really, really works for this project and the goals of my creative stakeholders. And then I'm going to do the bulk of my work right here in these 3 nodes. Everything that I do on top of this is going to be kind of extra. It's not that it's not important. It matters a lot to me, matters a lot to my clients because they're paying for my eye to detail. But I'll give you this rule of thumb that I've been talking about a lot lately with students. This right here, I mean, we talked about this actually in this week's video. 80% of the way this project, this timeline is going to feel to the average viewer, not to your client, not to you, to the average viewer, their experience of it, it's pretty well set by the time we finish this balancing pass that we talked about in part 2 this week. Yeah, there's other value adds that we can make and that we're going to make, but that's the remaining 20%. 80% of the experience is going to be determined by your color management, your look, and the way you expose, ratio, and balance each of your shots. So that's the other reason why my template node tree tends to be 5 or fewer nodes. And then on top of that, I'm going to add things as seasoning as necessary, but I'm not going to plan for that complexity to be necessary or plan to introduce it shot after shot after shot. I'm going to sort of layer it in there as needed, and I'm going to spend more time here on my primaries than most would because I recognize that by the time I'm moving off of primaries, for better or for worse, whatever I've been able to accomplish or haven't been able to accomplish, 80% of the battle has already been won or lost, if that makes sense. So yes to a template node graph, but in my case, I'm going to keep it dirt simple, like never more than 10 nodes. These node graphs that I see that other artists use, even colorists who I respect, of 10, 20, 30 nodes, that's a valid approach if that works for them, but it's just never been my approach. I don't want to account for that level of complexity being necessary or advantageous in my grade. I want it all to happen in a couple of nodes if I can make it work.
All right, output question here. In a Resolve ACES project, is it possible to set up several delivery outputs with different output transforms without changing the project output transform setting?
Not to my knowledge. That's a good question. I think the closest you could come off the top of my head would be to prep multiple timelines and then manage in nodes and change your output transform on those. Unless, let me just check something out here. These timeline settings, yeah, I don't have color management available here with these individual timeline settings. So no, good question. What I would do in that scenario is color manage in nodes and then duplicate my timeline and set different target outputs. Or honestly, I actually take that back completely. What I would do in the interest of not having to manage multiple timelines and making sure the edits are preserved and everything stays in place is I would just do multiple outputs. Output one, flip that output color space and output the other. I think that's a good idea actually to have like, hey, I want to tee up 3 outputs, one for theatrical, one for HDR 1000 nit, and one for Rec 709 of this timeline and Resolve. I just want you to handle it. To my knowledge, that's not possible. I could be wrong. I'm not like an expert on that side of things in Resolve, but to my knowledge, that's not currently possible.
All right, question from Costa here. What is your approach toward recovering burned highlights? I'm assuming that means overexposed.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I can't remember if we had this conversation or if I just really wanted to. So if I'm repeating myself, you guys will have to forgive me. So I want to talk about this phrase for a second. Costa's asking a great question that I think is a little slippery in its phrasing. This concept that we hear talked about so much in color grading of highlight recovery really frustrates me. There's actually no such thing as highlight recovery. You either recorded information or you didn't. There is no such thing as highlight recovery. And it has multiple meanings, but generally when we are talking about so-called highlight recovery, let's see if I can find a good example. In this timeline. This is all fairly subdued lighting. I'll tell you what, let's just go over into the workshop for a second. And I'm going to give you guys a very specific example of what we most commonly mean when we talk about highlight recovery, what most people are talking about. Let's see here. There's a specific shot that I am thinking about that I would really like to pull in. That's fine. And of course it's hiding from me. Let's see here. It's a shot that I've used many times. I'll just look for it over here. It's an airy shot. Let's see here. Okay, so much for finding the exact frame that I wanted to. Let's just look at give me some burned highlights somewhere. All right, I'm going to go back to our DaVinci wide gamut workflow. Let's just look at one of these shots where we're like aimed right at these light fixtures, okay? So what we are most commonly, what I've sort of come to conclude is that what most people are talking about when they talk about highlight recovery is something like this. It's like, oh, I've managed to bring back in some detail into those highlights. Although in this case, that those highlights truly are burned. Like there's nothing in there. There's nothing that was recorded to the negative. But a lot of the time when we talk about highlight recovery, all we're talking about is moving exposure such that details that are being clipped out by the transform into the fairly narrow dynamic range of Rec 709, such that those highlights are being brought back to life because we are shifting the exposure. So if you imagine like sort of a window, like let's say this area Alexa, for argument's sake, let's say it shoots 14 stops of dynamic range, okay? Normal Rec 709 display is going to reproduce 6, 7, 8 stops of dynamic range effectively. So if we think about the math problem of like, okay, how do we fit those 14 into that 6 to 8? Well, we don't. We do our best to try to compress things into place, but there's going to be stuff that spills on either side, right? So if we think about highlight recovery, all we're talking about is biasing what chunk of that 14 stops matters to us in terms of the way it's reproduced in Rec 709. So that's the thing with highlight recovery. If the highlights are there, then all you have to do to recover them is adjust your exposure so that you're getting you're prioritizing detail in the areas that matter to you. And I'm bummed that I couldn't find that shot that I had in mind because it would have made a more lucid example of this. But it's all a question of like, well, you can make a choice. You can expose for like the, shadow underneath the car or like the sky in the background of the shot, like it's all about prioritizing those things. But I just want to be clear that like highlight recovery is a total misnomer. Like we can do some things to try to like manufacture the presence of detail in areas where none was recorded, but not much. And generally speaking, that's going to produce pretty like synthetic, plasticky feeling results. So most of the time, like highlight recovery, I think it's a concept we need to adjust and recognize like we actually can't recover highlights. We can make sure that we don't destroy them. We can prioritize the way that we are reproducing a large dynamic range and a smaller dynamic range display state, but we can't recover highlights. All we can do is make sure we don't destroy them and ensure that the highlights or the tonal regions that are most important to us are being prioritized in terms of the final dynamic range of our display. So that's maybe sort of bad news or like a bummer to say like highlight recovery is kind of a myth, but like that would be my take is there's not much we can do to actually recover information that's not there or to give the sense that there's information present that actually wasn't. Instead, all we want to do is make sure we're not doing anything to destroy highlights or texture or tonal detail that we want, and then that we are appropriately prioritizing those highlights based on our creative agenda. Okay, that was actually a great question to end things on because we made it to the bottom of the hour here, guys. Thanks for coming out for an earlier edition of Grade School. I now have to bounce because I'm going to get into my webinar for Blackmagic Design on color management. So if you guys feel like hanging out with me for another 2 hours, you're not sick of me yet, come join me over there. I'd love to see you in there. Give me a shout in the chat over there if you do make it over and let me know you came over from Grade School or from YouTube. And we're going to be talking about color management in broadest strokes inside of DaVinci Resolve, the different flavors of it, how they work. It's a great companion to everything that we've been talking about in the last couple of weeks here in Grade School and on the channel. So I hope you'll join me on there. And other than that, I think I gave you guys all the good announcements at the top of the hour in terms of the upcoming show LUT course, Elements LUTs, ebook, FPE LUT for 2383, and all that good jazz. So I hope this helped fill out and answer any questions that may have come up for you from part 2 of our DaVinci Wide Gamut workflow series. Part 3 is coming up next week. Excited to share that with you guys. We're going to talk about secondaries and finesse and that sort of like remaining 20% that I referenced a couple minutes ago. Like, all right, we've got our primaries, we got our look, we got our color management in place. Now what are we going to do to really finesse and sweeten this so that our client is as happy as can be and we're as happy as we can be with the image. It's an important part of the process. I don't want to knock it at all. I just want to properly place it into our overall priorities and sequencing of the way we tackle things. So that's what we're going to be focused on solely in that next part of the video. Thank you guys very much for joining me this morning. Thanks to Gadali for co-hosting with me, and I hope you guys have an awesome weekend, and I'll see you next week. Take care.